Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells, and before we even begin with anything tonight, I just want to warn you that this episode is much more intense than many of the episodes that we do here on Spooky AS. I said when I started the show that we would cover anything and everything that could be considered spooky, and that includes light topics, but it also includes much more serious topics like today's episode, which is going to be about the case known as Mr. Cruel. This was suggested by a listener, and I find this case fascinating myself, and I believe that many of you will as well, but it does have a much darker tone than our normal episode, and it does involve crimes against children, including child rape. So I wanted to mention that right at the front, and perhaps you will decide this episode is not the one for you, and you can go back to listening to a different episode, maybe about video games or creepy foods or something we might do in the future. But this is a rather intense episode, so with that warning, let's begin. Alright, as I already told you, this is Spooky Ass Shit, and I am your host, Eric Dwinells. Tonight we are going to be talking about Mr. Cruel. And like I said, very heavy subject. Before we dive into it, let's get the plugs out of the way. You can visit the show on our website at spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place. That is the show's blog page. From there you can find links to all of our social media, including our Twitter and Instagram. We are at Spooky Ass Shit on both of those places. And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. Don't forget to join our closed group, the Spookaroos, where you can discuss episodes and talk about your favorite spooky things without the weight of public judgment. Also on the website, you can oftentimes find pictures to go along with each episode, and these are pictures you could easily find by Googling, but just for your convenience, they are put right on the website, and this case will be no exception. There are several visual elements that I think you guys are going to want to check out. Those will be put up on the website. On August 22nd, 1987, in the town of Lower Plenty, a suburb of Melbourne, Australia, a man broke into a family home at 4 a.m., armed with a knife and a gun. He made his way to the master bedroom and forced the couple who had been sleeping in their beds to turn onto their stomachs. He tied them. He then made his way to the children's room. He came to the boys' room first, where he tied up and gagged the 6-year-old. He then walked into the 11-year-old girl's room and raped her. The stranger remained inside the house for at least 2 hours, even taking a break and preparing a sandwich for himself. He stole a box full of classical records and a dark blue coat with a fur collar. He made a phone call while he was still in the house, and the girl remembered that he said something like, "Hey bozo, you better move your kids, or they'll be in real danger." The police were called. They examined the phone records after the girl reported the call that the stranger had made. Police discovered the phone company had no record of a phone call taking place from the home that morning, so the stranger must have only pretended to make a call. Police came to believe this, plus the items he took from the house, were simply red herrings, designed to confuse police about his true motives that morning, which seemed to be merely the rape of the 11-year-old girl. On December 27th, 1988, father of 4 John Willis was having trouble sleeping. His wife and 4 daughters slept soundly in their beds, but John was up in the wee hours of the morning working on a jigsaw puzzle in an effort to relax. Sometime around 5 a.m., Mr. Willis was finally ready for bed. He settled in next to his wife, but he did not see the man outside watching him through the window. About half an hour after John had gone to bed, the stranger entered his home through the back door. He walked directly to the master bedroom. Mrs. Willis woke up first to find a stranger standing over her. He wore a dark-colored ski mask and blue coveralls. He was pointing a gun at her. Instinctively, Mrs. Willis began screaming, yelling at her girls to run out of the house. The stranger told her to shut up. He then pointed the gun at Mr. Willis's head and asked, "Are you gonna be a hero?" Mr. Willis said no. The stranger forced the couple to lie down on their bed and tied them up using copper wire. He demanded money, and Mr. Willis indicated there was money in the bedside table drawer. The stranger opened it and removed $35. He then left the bedroom and walked down the hall. 10-year-old Sharon Willis had woken up when she heard her mother screaming. She saw the stranger enter her room. As he entered, he said, "Hello, Sharon." He covered her mouth with tape, blindfolded her, and carried her out of the house under his arm. After approximately 15 minutes, Mr. and Mrs. Willis were able to escape their bindings. Mr. Willis ran to the girls' room only to discover that Sharon was missing. He attempted to call police, but the phone line had been cut. He ran to a neighbor's, pounding on the door and asking them to call the police, while he searched the neighborhood for any trace of his daughter. He found none. Police arrived and searched the neighborhood. Police in surrounding towns were notified as well, but there was no trace of the girl or her abductor, and they could find no witnesses. The Willis family hoped the stranger had taken Sharon to hold for ransom, as he had demanded and taken some money. Police were skeptical, however, as no demand for ransom had been made, and there was no ransom note at the scene of the crime. Police theorized that the request for money was just another red herring. Police began preparing Mr. and Mrs. Willis for the worst. At 11:15 that evening, about 5 miles from the Willis home, a local motorist was in a near collision with another vehicle which had been driving in the dark without its headlights on. The local man became irate and turned to follow the no-headlights car, which he described as a white Commodore Vacationer sedan with 3 blue stripes down its side. He pulled up next to the Commodore at the next red light and reported that the driver was purposely avoiding his gaze. He stated that the male driver turned his head and hunched over the steering wheel in an effort apparently not to be seen. No other passengers were visible in the vehicle. The mysterious driver was thought to be young, somewhere in his 20s. When the light turned green, the Commodore took off, heading in the direction of Bayswater High School. The local driver did not pursue the Commodore further, nor did he attempt to get his license plate number, since there had been no actual damage done to either car. Perhaps this incident had nothing to do with the child abduction earlier in the day, but then again, perhaps it did. Just after midnight, an unidentified female motorist saw a young girl walking down the street in front of Bayswater High School. The girl was dressed in garbage bags and covered by a man's shirt. The motorist stopped and asked the girl if she was okay. The girl replied very coolly, "My name is Sharon Willis. I was taken from my home early this morning. A man left me here and told me to go and ring home." Police and the Willis family were alerted. Sharon was taken to the hospital. It had been 18 hours since she had been abducted. She had been kept blindfolded for the duration of her abduction. Sharon said the stranger was occasionally gruff, but mostly soft-spoken. He gave her a glass of milk and a Vegemite sandwich. Later on, he also brought her some lemonade. She went on to tell police how just prior to releasing her, the stranger had made her stand in a large plastic garbage bag, which he then pulled up over her and taped it to her shoulders. He then put another bag over her head before cutting out a hole for her face to fit through. Over this, he placed the men's shirt. He then drove her towards her home, lifted her over the fence of the school, and dropped her in the yard before telling her to walk across the oval towards the house with its lights on. She heard his car drive away, and then she started walking towards the house that he had told her to. But the gravel cut her bare feet, so she changed direction and walked towards Armstrong Road, where she was discovered. She also told investigators that the stranger had washed her thoroughly from head to toe including under her nails and even flossing her teeth before releasing her. He had done the same to himself. Further details of what the stranger did to Sharon while he held her captive were never made public. 18 months later, on July 3rd, 1990, about 10 miles from the Willis house, 13-year-old Nicola Lynas was at home with her 15-year-old sister, Fiona. The family was preparing to move back to their native England. They would be out of the country in a matter of days. The girls were sleeping in their beds, and their parents were out to dinner with friends. At about 11:40 p.m., the stranger broke into their house through a window. He made his way to the girls' room, carrying a knife and a handgun. Dressed in dark clothing and wearing a balaclava mask, he shook the girls awake and threatened to kill them if they did not do as he said. He tied up Fiona, telling her, "Tell your father I want $25,000. She would later describe the man as soft-spoken and estimate his age to be about 30. He told Nicola to go and get her school uniform. The stranger put the uniform and some underwear into a bag. He then took the keys to the rental car the girl's parents had been using. The stranger forced Nicola into the car at gunpoint and drove off into the night. Within the hour, Mr. and Mrs. Lynas had returned from dinner to find Fiona tied up and Nicola missing. They called the police, and the investigation was launched. Fiona mentioned the ransom demand, and her parents were willing to pay it, but the stranger had left no instructions on when or how to pay the ransom. Police monitored all phone calls to the house. No witnesses came forward to report anything suspicious about that night. Police eventually released a statement saying they considered the situation to be very dangerous. They believed the Lynases had been specifically targeted and felt it was likely that the abductor had been watching the family for days or even weeks leading up to the crime. They did not rule out the idea of the perpetrator being the same as Sharon Willis's abductor and the same man from the August 87 attack. Police began talking to the neighbors and Nicola's classmates at school, but no solid leads turned up. The Lynas' rental car was discovered abandoned the following afternoon, only a few blocks away from the family home. A $100,000 reward was offered for information on the case. On July 6th, at about 2 a.m., Nicola was allowed to dress and then forced into a car by the stranger. He stopped the car about 6 miles from Nicola's home and ordered her to get out. He wrapped her in a blanket and demanded that she sit down and place her head between her legs. Once she did so, the stranger drove off. It was Nicola's 14th birthday. Nicola made her way to a nearby home and asked to use their phone. She called her father, and she was then taken to the hospital. It had been 50 hours since she'd been abducted. Nicola reported that she had been kept tied up and blindfolded the entire time. Like Sharon, she reported that her abductor was meticulous when it came to cleaning her in an effort to remove any evidence of his crimes. She guessed he was young, not more than 40. He had worn a mask, a dark green balaclava with light-colored stitching around the eyes and mouth. It looked handmade. Nicola stated that on the night of her abduction, the stranger had driven her parents' rental car for about 10 minutes before forcing her into another car and throwing a blanket on top of her. He forced her to curl up under the dashboard on the passenger side as he drove. About 45 minutes later, she was taken out of the car in a suburban area and led into a house. She heard no one else in the house besides herself and the abductor for the duration of her captivity. The stranger watched the press conference given by Nicola's father, and he mentioned it to her. She stated that he liked watching news reports and reading about himself in the paper. She told police that at no point did the stranger threaten her with any violence. She had been given food and drink. She described her attacker as affectionate and chummy. He called her Missy Sharon and Nicola both provided details of their abduction to the police, though many of those details have not been made public. The girls state that they were shackled to a large bed with a rough collar placed around their necks. The stranger warned the girls not to remove their blindfolds, or he would have to kill them. He was quoted as saying, "My freedom is more important than your life." Press coverage began to explode at this point, and eventually the stranger was given a nickname, Mr. Cruel. The press and police began to speculate on the true identity of Mr. Cruel. He may have had some sort of forensic training, which would make him especially knowledgeable about how to destroy trace evidence. Perhaps he had a background in science and worked in a forensic lab. Or, more distressingly, perhaps he was a cop. Although they were considering every possibility, investigators said there just wasn't enough evidence to say for certain who or what Mr. Cruel was. They were quick to point out that although it was possible Mr. Cruel had a background in law enforcement, it was equally likely that he had simply watched a lot of television or read a lot of books. The way he washed and scrubbed himself and his victims showed that he was aware of how forensics could be collected, but it didn't require any specialized skill or knowledge. Admitting that they were at a loss when it came to identifying any suspects, investigators turned to the American FBI for help. They asked the FBI to create a profile about their suspect. This type of criminal profiling is more of an art than it is a science, but it had been used before and to some acclaim in the United States. The FBI created a profile for the unknown perpetrator, but the details were not released to the public until 2006. Here is that profile. As stated in the initial analysis, we believe this offender may reside in the vicinity of the first assault. This is further strengthened by the fact that the offender has returned to the same general area in the fourth assault. In cases of serial sexual assault, this type of clustering indicates an area of great significance to the offender. Usually, it indicates that the offender lives there, while in other cases, it reflects his employment. In this case, we believe it is more probable that the offender resides in the area, in view of the fact that these incidents all occurred during school holidays. Coupled with the offender's use of a school uniform in his third assault, we suggest there is a high degree of probability that the offender is involved with a school. He may be employed or connected with a school in some other capacity. The offender has an intense interest in children, especially children in the age range which he is assaulting. He will spend a great deal of time with these children in what appears to be selfless dedication to the students. This apparent dedication may well have earned him recognition and awards, Teacher of the Year, Coach of the Year, Exceptional Volunteer, etc. These type of awards may make the offender appear above suspicion to those who know him. It is imperative that the material to be released publicly focuses on dispelling the myth of a monster. Citizens have a misconception regarding child molesters in general, believing them to be the stereotyped monsters, men with raincoats, disheveled in appearance, etc. In reality, of course, this is not the case. The public needs to be educated as to the true characteristics and appearance of the offender. Those who know the offender at this time believe him to be a quote-unquote nice guy, one who is genuinely interested in and dedicated to helping children, and therefore is currently above their suspicion. He will have his own homemade pornography, as well as commercial pornography. He will have photographed and or videotaped his sexual assaults on the victims. These items will have great personal significance to him, and he will not destroy them unless he believes that law enforcement officials are aware that they exist. Because of the profound evidentiary value of these items, no mention of this should be made publicly. His use of commercial pornography, including bondage, captivity, and the slavery-type themes, is to be expected. These items may be discussed more safely in public forums, as those close to him will be aware of these items. We don't want to disclose any information which may cause the offender to remove himself from the area or otherwise change his routine. We need him to remain where he is and continue his normal routine, so the appeal to the public will have the greatest opportunity to be effective. Based on our research and the investigative experience in similar cases, we have found the following characteristics and traits to be present in such offenders. 1. He is likely a functional individual, one who has steady employment, is generally regarded as a good neighbor, polite and quiet, sometimes introverted, but he may be involved in certain community-minded projects. 2. He typically would live in a single-family residence with one garage or carport. 3. He may or may not live with someone. If he does live with someone, they were absent from the residence during the critical time spans of these offenses. 4. If involved in a relationship, the partner would be aware of his sexual dysfunction on the part of the offender. The offender's sexual arousal and gratification would be dependent upon the partner acting out a certain role, dressing in a specific manner, such as in a schoolgirl uniform, etc. 5. Those who work around or with the offender would notice a change in his behavior after these incidents. The offender would have trouble coping with the events, and would be likely to miss work immediately after the event, or if he did work, he would be preoccupied and display an inability to concentrate on the task at hand. He would appear rigid, distant, and somewhat incommunicative. 6. His normal routine would be disrupted during and immediately after the offense. Those close to him may notice a change in his usual use of alcohol or drugs, either increased use or abstinence. Sometimes these offenders show a short-term interest in religion. 7. The offender's mind. In the offender's mind, there is no intent to harm the children. The incidents are sexually motivated and represent the culmination of a number of psychological factors unique to the offender. He has a rich fantasy life which manifests itself through the use of commercial pornography. 8. In general, the offender appears normal and above suspicion to those around him. This ability has enabled him to keep from being identified to date. 9. The offender will also read this article, and, in all probability, will attempt to change or control his behaviors. He will not, however, be able to change the past. His attempts to change his behavior will result in his appearing more rigid and over-controlled. 10. Regardless of the ultimate fate of the victim, the offender will experience a great deal of stress, which he will not be able to control. This stress will manifest itself in the forementioned manners and behaviors. Following their receipt of this profile, investigators stated that they believed Mr. Cruel may be responsible for numerous attacks dating as far back as 1984. On April 13, 1991, 13-year-old Carmen Chan was at home watching a documentary about Marilyn Monroe with her two younger sisters, Carly, 9, and Karen, 7. The girls had been left home alone while their parents worked at a Chinese restaurant which they owned. At around 9 p.m., Mr. Cruel made his way into the Chan's property after tampering with their security system and getting over their security gate. He then used spray paint to write on a car in the driveway. His message read, "Payback. More to come. Asian drug deal." Shortly thereafter, Carmen and Carly made their way to the kitchen for a snack when they heard a noise and walked down the hall to investigate. As they entered the hall, they encountered Mr. Cruel, wearing a gray tracksuit and a dark-colored balaclava. He ordered the girls back into the bedroom, where he also found the youngest sister hiding, curled up behind the door. Mr. Cruel threatened the girls with a knife and forced the younger girls into a wardrobe. He told the girls that he only wanted money, and once he was gone, their older sister would come and let them out. He then pushed the bed up against the wardrobe so that the girls would be trapped inside. At about 9:30, Mr. Cruel forced Carmen out of the house and disappeared with her into the night. 15 minutes later, the younger sisters managed to free themselves from the wardrobe and called their father at the restaurant, saying a man with a knife had taken Carmen. John Chan rushed home to search for Carmen, but she truly was gone. The police were called. They knew right away that this was most likely the work of Mr. Cruel, and a massive search was begun. All available units were added to the search, including helicopters and tracking dogs. The Chan sisters described the masked man as 25 to 35 years old, with a slim to medium build, and rather short, at 5'5" or 5'9" tall. The tracking dogs did pick up a scent, but the trail ended abruptly down the street. Police believe this is where Mr. Cruel had parked his car. Neighbors were interviewed, but again, they all claimed not to have seen or heard anything unusual that night. Police noted the graffiti left on the Chan's car, but they quickly surmised that this was just another red herring used by Mr. Cruel in an attempt to confuse them. Police immediately noticed Carmen was a student at the same school as Mr. Cruel's previous victim, Nicola Lynas, but they were also hesitant to read too much into this, for fear that this was another purposeful red herring which would make the police focus their investigation on the school and the people who worked there unnecessarily. Still, they didn't completely dismiss the connection. Eventually, they would ask the students to fill out questionnaires regarding any suspicious people or activity they may have witnessed in the weeks leading up to the attack. The day after the abduction, Carmen's parents, John and Phyllis Chan, gave a press conference. Phyllis's appeal to her daughter's abductor is one of the most famous and heartbreaking moments related to this case. Although there is video of it online, I will not be including the actual audio here. It is truly heartbreaking. The anguish in this poor woman's voice as she pleads with Mr. Cruel for her child's life leaves an indelible mark. Her statements include an appeal to Carmen herself, saying, "Carmen, look, this is your favorite dress. You wear it every day. Last Saturday, you left it at home. You have to come home and wear it. Your sisters need you." She tried to continue, but eventually she began to sob so much that her words became almost unintelligible as she pleaded, "Bring my daughter home safe. Please release my daughter," before finally breaking down before the microphone. Mr. Cruel had committed his first rape inside the home. Then he kept his second victim for 18 hours, and his third for a total of 50 hours. Police hoped that, although it had now been several days since Carmen had been abducted, perhaps Mr. Cruel would let her go too. But as the days wore on, investigators began to have their doubts. Perhaps Mr. Cruel had finally crossed the line to murder. On May 1st, it was announced that a special task force had been created to investigate the Mr. Cruel case. It would be known as Operation Spectrum. They created a poster containing images of the 3 girls Mr. Cruel had abducted. The poster was widely circulated, both in the press and in local shops and bus stations. Rewards were offered, bringing the total up to $300,000 for information leading to the arrest of Mr. Cruel. Tips poured in, and investigators created a list of about 130 viable suspects who they began to look into with great care. On May 2nd, Phyllis Chan wrote an open letter to Mr. Cruel. It read, "To the man who took Carmen Chan. Dear Mr. Kind, not Mr. Cruel. We miss Carmen very much. Please let Carmen go. We know you are a kind and caring person. We hope Carmen is safe with you. School has resumed, and it would be nice if Carmen could return to school. Thank you for letting her free, and we can rebuild our lives. Please hear our plea. Love from the Chan family. Father, mother, and sisters of Carmen." On May 5th, investigators announced that it was more likely than not that Mr. Cruel had murdered Carmen. The Operation Spectrum poster was delivered to almost 2 million homes in the area. Working on the suspicion that Mr. Cruel had watched Carmen get off the bus near her parents' restaurant and followed her home from there, police set up a roadblock on the bus route and questioned drivers and further distributed the poster. It was the largest investigation in Australian history up to that point. Phyllis Chan penned another open letter pleading for her daughter's safe return and stating that Carmen's sisters' birthdays were coming up and the only thing either one of them wanted was their big sister to come home. Both sisters were having a very difficult time dealing with the loss of their sister and their own trauma from that night. Carly began sleepwalking. In a daze, she would roam around the house, saying, "Carmen, are you home yet?" Phyllis Chan decided to try a new tactic. She thought that maybe Mr. Cruel had Carmen, but perhaps he was afraid to reach out to the Chan family because he knew the police would get involved, so she wrote another open letter containing a code that could only be deciphered by asking Carmen the names of family friends still living in China. The code would reveal a secret P.O. box that the police did not have access to, where Mr. Cruel could write personally to Phyllis. John Chan began receiving phone calls from a man demanding $15,000 for information on the whereabouts of Carmen. The man also threatened to kill John if he did not comply. Police were able to trace the calls, however, and after investigating it, they determined that the calls were coming from a prison inmate who knew nothing about the crimes. It was simply a plot, an attempt to extort money from the grieving Chan family. On April 9, 1992, just days shy of the one-year anniversary of Carmen's abduction, a man was walking his dog near an isolated power station about 12 miles from the Chan home. Part of the area had been used as a landfill, but it had recently been disturbed by nearby construction. As the man walked his dog past the area, he noticed a human skull in the freshly exposed earth. Police were called, and an extensive search revealed more bones in a shallow grave. The skull was examined and found to have 3 bullet holes. It was confirmed to be the remains of Carmen Chan. Investigators came to believe that Carmen had been killed shortly after being abducted. They speculated that Mr. Cruel had killed Carmen because she had seen his face. Phyllis Chan agreed that that was a likelihood. She said Carmen was not the kind of girl who would go quietly while being abducted, and she believes that she probably removed the blindfold that Mr. Cruel had placed on her in order to confront him. Police believed that Mr. Cruel likely felt remorse and/or depression after Carmen's death. They reached out to every therapist and psychologist in the province, asking them to break the doctor-patient confidentiality if any of their patients had come to them in the past year expressing remorse over crimes committed against a child. They asked these doctors to consider which was more important, their obligations to a single patient or the safety of the entire community. Many doctors did respond, and all leads were investigated. Investigators even sought help from an American convicted kidnapper and child murderer, Richard Stirrup. Stirrup's crimes mirrored those of Mr. Cruel, in that he too would kidnap his victims for a short time before suddenly releasing them, until he eventually murdered one child. Police hoped that he would be able to give some insight into Mr. Cruel. Nothing ever came of it, and it is unknown if Stirrup actually ever even met with the investigators. On January 27, 1993, police released further details about what was known about Mr. Cruel. One of his victims stated that Mr. Cruel has acted as if he were talking to somebody else during her captivity, but the victim never heard anyone respond, and determined that Mr. Cruel was not actually talking to anyone, but only pretending to. Neither surviving victim heard or saw anyone other than Mr. Cruel in the house for the duration of their abduction. Victims report that the driveway was on the right side of the house, which was located in a quiet neighborhood with little traffic. It was only a few steps from the car to the door of Mr. Cruel's home. One victim, at the risk of her life, peeked out from under her blindfold during her captivity and was able to describe some of Mr. Cruel's house. She had drawn sketches of the rooms, and those sketches were made public. It showed a room with a beige carpet, a dark-colored blanket placed over some kind of unknown furniture, peach-colored, full-length curtains, 2 bedside tables, one of which held a small lamp with an orange base and a yellow and white striped lampshade. It also contained a large bed with an orange headboard and a video camera on a tripod at the foot of the bed. There was also a sketch of Mr. Cruel's bathroom, although this sketch was less detailed. The room and fixtures were all white and contained a wall-mounted sink, a glass shower unit with a sliding door, and a separate bathtub. There was also a beige-colored bath mat. Both victims also thought they could hear planes landing nearby, which led police to believe that Mr. Cruel lived near the airport. They searched over 30,000 homes along the normal flight paths to the airport. Police had kept these details quiet until they had finished their door-to-door search of these homes. But the search had been concluded, and the police were now releasing these details in the hopes that the public might be able to help. Tips were called in and more homes were searched, but this also came to nothing. By 1994, the Spectrum Task Force was scaled back from 40 investigators to 10. Police expressed their frustration over their inability to capture Mr. Cruel and assured the public that if new information turned up that required more officers to investigate fully, Operation Spectrum would be expanded once again. Meanwhile, the stress of losing their daughter and being in the public eye took a toll on the Chan family. Phyllis and John soon divorced, and Phyllis faced major financial setbacks, including the loss of her home and her car. She was still able to keep her restaurant. She had purchased a guard dog to keep watch over her and the girls. In early 1995, someone poisoned the Chan's dog. A few weeks later, at about 12:30 a.m., Phyllis was returning home from a 16-hour workday at the restaurant. She was carrying the day's takings and got out of her car when she was clubbed from behind with an unknown wooden object. She pleaded, "I am Carmen Chan's mother, please don't." The attacker struck Mrs. Chan several more times in the head before fleeing with the money. She required hospitalization to recover from her attack. Some speculated that the attacker may have been Mr. Cruel, seeking to further torment the Chan family. Eventually, however, it was discovered that the attacker was a former restaurant employee. In 2016, the 25th anniversary of Carmen Chan's abduction, a new reward was offered by Victoria Police for information leading to the arrest and conviction of her killer. The reward now stands at $1 million. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, the suspected Golden State Killer, sparked renewed interest in the Mr. Cruel case, as the MOs of both perpetrators matched to some extent. Investigators in both the U.S. and Australia do not seem to give this theory much credit. After all, with very limited exceptions, the Golden State Killer did not attack or molest children. Further, there is proof that Joseph D'Angelo was living in the United States for the entirety of the Mr. Cruel crime spree. There have been no cases linked to Mr. Cruel since the murder of Carmen Chan. Police believe this is either because the perpetrator has died, been convicted of some other unrelated crime, moved, or became too nervous to continue after seeing the intense efforts of law enforcement. Or, they admit, it is possible that Mr. Cruel has continued to offend, but further crimes have not been linked to him due to changes in his MO. Mr. Cruel is believed to have videotaped or taken still photographs of his attacks. Detectives believe that if he is still alive, he will have kept these tapes and/or photos and will still collect, and possibly swap, child pornography. They say he almost certainly continues to collect pornography through the internet and may communicate with children using chat rooms. There are still 32 people police identify as strong suspects, though none have been named publicly. The true identity of Mr. Cruel remains unknown. And that is the case of Mr. Cruel. Very intriguing and very heartbreaking. A lot of people kind of consider this to be the Australian version of the Golden State Killer, or East Area Rapist, or original Night Stalker case, in that it's a masked man breaking into a house. This one, of course, he's taking children. Golden State Killer attacked adults, but you can see that there are certain similarities, although, as we said in the telling of the tale, that they are almost certainly not related. But similar MOs to start with, and definitely the terror that the story creates. A stranger in a mask coming into your home at night and violating the safety of your home and remaining at large for an extended period of time. You can see where those comparisons can be drawn. My hope for this case, and I'm sure many of yours too, is that much like the Golden State Killer, they are able to eventually apprehend someone and hold them accountable for these crimes. The police have admitted that they have lost some of the evidence, including tape that was used as binding in some of the early attacks, which might have contained DNA. So that obviously is extremely unfortunate, to say the least. but perhaps through geolocating and perhaps some traces left online through these, dark web websites with child pornography and all that, hopefully they will find some way to be able to track this person, and they will finally have an answer as to the true identity of Mr. Cruel, and all of Australia, I'm sure, will breathe a sigh of relief if and when that day comes, and we all can hope that it does. A lot of information for today's episode came from the Herald Sun, which you can visit at heraldsun.com.au, and the Case File podcast. If you have not listened to Case File and you're a true crime fan, I don't know what to tell you. If you're really missing out. For my money, this is consistently the best true crime podcast. They release episodes regularly. They're always well researched, not always 100% spot on, but pretty damn close and very enjoyable. And if you're lucky, you will have something that takes place in the year 1999, because maybe this is I can't think of the term right now, but maybe it's wrong to laugh at, but it's funny to hear a man with an Australian accent say 1999. You'll see why. Normally, at the end of the episode, I can't tell you what's coming up next week because I don't always know. I don't always plan it out so far in advance. But this time, I do happen to know because I'm doing a pre-recorded episode next week. It will be about the 2018 film Halloween. Me and Lil Beastie, Lilith Beast, talk about the movie. We had very different reactions on Facebook after seeing the movie. So I thought it would be interesting to talk to someone who felt very differently about the movie than I did. So that is what you will hear next week. I did record it while I was sick, so you're going to hear me sounding sick again. And the good news is I'm all better now. So as you're listening to it, hopefully I'm in good health. Once again, I'd like to point you to the show's website, spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the same place, show's blog page. You know all about it. Every episode's available, even the ones no longer available on iTunes and other streaming services. You can also find links to all of our social media. We are at Spooky Ass Shit on both Twitter and Instagram. And you can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. And don't forget to join the Spookaroos when you're there. And on the website, you can go to the store. Yeah, we have some merchandise now. If you're a true blue Spookaroo and you just have to show it and show your pride, well, guess what? I got a design just for you. The True Blue Spookaroo t-shirt, tote bag, or sticker to satisfy your Spookaroo needs. Thank you again so much for listening. If you know someone that you feel would enjoy the show, please, please, please do pass it on. I don't advertise. The only way this show grows is through your help. So I truly do appreciate it, and I truly appreciate your choosing to listen to this show. Until next time, don't be afraid.